The Kithra were once the galaxy's miracle workers, you know? Picture these crystalline beings who could literally heal with a touch, their bodies humming with bioelectric energy that could knit broken bones and mend torn flesh like magic. But here's the thing that made them truly special. They weren't just healers. They were artists of life itself. When a Kithra placed their shimmering hands on a dying patient, it wasn't just medical treatment. It was like watching someone paint with pure life force, weaving damaged cells back together with the kind of precision that would make our best surgeons weep with envy. These weren't your typical aliens either. The Kithra had built their entire civilization around the idea that all life was sacred, every single living thing connected by invisible threads of energy that they could actually see and touch. Their cities were living works of art, crystalline spires that grew rather than being constructed, pulsing with gentle light that matched the rhythm of every heartbeat within miles. They had no weapons, no armies, no concept of violence beyond the basic understanding that some species in the galaxy weren't as enlightened as they were. For thousands of years, this philosophy worked perfectly. The Kithra became the galaxy's most sought-after healers, traveling between star systems in their beautiful ships that looked more like floating crystals than spacecraft. Entire civilizations would trade fortunes just to have a single Kithra healer visit their world. Plagues that had wiped out billions were cured with a gentle touch. Birth defects that had plagued species for generations simply vanished under their care. They were living proof that the universe could be kind, that intelligence didn't have to come with claws and fangs. Then came the Hegemony Wars, and everything changed. Picture the bloodiest conflict the galaxy had ever seen. Entire star systems burning, billions dying, ancient civilizations reduced to radioactive dust. The major powers were desperate for any advantage they could find, and someone had a brilliant idea. Why not force the Kithra to weaponize their gifts? If they could heal, surely they could harm. If they could mend tissue, they could destroy it just as easily. The request started politely enough. Diplomatic missions asking for defensive assistance and strategic medical support. But soon the request became demands, and the demands became threats. Military commanders showed up at Kithra healing centers with contracts and ultimatums. Turn your gifts into weapons, or watch your patients die while you could prevent it. Help us win this war, or be responsible for everyone we lose because you refuse to act. But here's what made the Kithra truly extraordinary. They said no, not just to one side, but to everyone. They refused to corrupt their life-giving abilities for any cause, no matter how justified it seemed. Even when the war reached their own peaceful worlds, even when their own people were dying, they held to their principles with a stubbornness that would have made humans proud. The galaxy's reaction was swift and brutal. If the Kithra wouldn't choose a side, then they were enemies of everyone. Their status as beloved healers evaporated overnight. They were branded as traitors, cowards, and worse, accomplices to every death they could have prevented. One by one, their beautiful cities were destroyed, their people scattered, their ships hunted across the stars like criminals. Elder Zephyr had been a young healer when the persecution began, watching his world burn while holding to the ancient promise never to use his gift for harm. Now he was old, his crystalline body dim with exhaustion and grief, leading the last 300 survivors to the endless void in ships that were falling apart around them. They'd been running for years, jumping from system to system, always one step ahead of bounty hunters and military patrols who saw them as prizes to be collected or threats to be eliminated. Their ships were dying, without proper crystals to maintain them, without the specialized energy sources or technology required. Every jump brought them closer to drifting dead in space. The children were growing weak, their natural bioelectric fields flickering like dying flames. The elders spoke in whispers of the old days, of home worlds that no longer existed, of a time when their touch brought joy instead of fear. That's when their failing sensors caught something impossible. A small yellow star with a blue-green planet that practically sang with life. The energy readings were unlike anything they'd encountered, chaotic but vibrant, primitive but incredibly strong. It felt alive in a way that called to their starving bodies like nothing had in years. Elder Zephyr made a decision that would change everything. They would risk everything on this unknown world, because the alternative was dying slowly in the cold emptiness between the stars. Now here's where it gets interesting. When those battered Kithra ships limped into Earth's atmosphere, humanity did something that completely broke every first contact protocol in the book. Picture this: 3 massive crystalline vessels, clearly alien, clearly damaged, dropping out of the sky over rural Montana on a Tuesday morning. Every military base on the planet went to high alert. Fighter jets were scrambling, missile systems were powering up, and somewhere in a bunker, generals were probably arguing about whether to shoot first and ask questions later. But Dr. Kyle Morrison wasn't thinking like a general that day. He was ahead of the CDC's emergency response team, and he'd been called in because someone with more sense than fear had noticed these weren't invasion ships. They were refugee vessels, and they were falling apart. When Kyle got his first look at the readings coming from those ships, the energy signatures, the life signs, the clear signs of failing life support, his medical training kicked in before his survival instincts could catch up. The decision to send doctors instead of soldiers wasn't made in some high-level government meeting. It was made by a small group of scientists and medical professionals who looked at the data and saw what everyone else was missing. These weren't conquerors coming to destroy Earth. These were people who were dying, and they needed help. Kyle grabbed every mobile medical unit he could find, loaded them with basic supplies, and headed straight for the crash site while the military was still arguing about jurisdiction. What Kyle saw when those ship doors opened changed everything. These crystalline beings weren't the terrifying aliens from science fiction movies. They were refugees in the truest sense, exhausted, malnourished, and clearly at the end of their rope. The adults were barely able to stand, their natural glow dimmed to almost nothing. The children, and Kyle could tell they were children despite being completely different from humans, were clinging to their parents with a universal desperation of scared kids everywhere. But here's what really got to Kyle and his team. When they approached with medical equipment and supplies, the Kithra didn't react with aggression or even suspicion. They reacted with something Kyle had seen in refugee camps around the world: hopeful desperation. These beings have been running so long, had been rejected by so many, that the simple act of humans approaching with help instead of weapons seemed to overwhelm them completely. The language barrier should have been impossible to overcome, but humans have this weird talent for communicating through crisis. Kyle's team started with the basics, pointing to medical supplies, demonstrating that the food was safe, using hand gestures that somehow managed to cross species lines. When one of the Kithra children collapsed from what was clearly malnutrition, Kyle didn't hesitate. He scooped up this crystalline being that weighed almost nothing and looked nothing like a human child, and carried them to the nearest medical station like he'd done it 1,000 times before. That moment changed everything. The adult Kithra saw this human, this complete stranger from a species they'd never encountered, treating their child with the same care he'd show his own. The barriers started coming down immediately. Elder Zephes, despite being barely conscious himself, tried to communicate through gestures and expressions that somehow transcended language. He was trying to say thank you, but also try to warn them, we're dangerous to your technology. We need specific things to survive. We might not be able to stay. Kyle's response was pure human stubbornness. He didn't care about the technical problems, didn't worry about the political implications, didn't even think about the career consequences of making first contact decisions without government approval. He saw people who needed help, and helping people was what he did. When the Kithra's bioelectric fields started interfering with medical equipment, Kyle's team adapted. When it became clear they needed specific minerals not found in standard medical supplies, Kyle got on the phone and started calling geology departments at universities. The most beautiful part was watching the rest of humanity's response. As word spread about what was happening in Montana, instead of panic or fear, there was this incredible outpouring of curiosity and compassion. Linguists started showing up to help with communication. Engineers arrived to figure out how to build shelters that wouldn't short-circuit around Kithra energy fields. Local families brought food, clothes, and toys for the children, even though nobody was quite sure what Kithra children might actually need or want. Within 48 hours, what should have been a military situation had turned into the world's most unusual humanitarian crisis. And humanity, being humanity, rolled up their sleeves and got to work. They didn't understand technology, couldn't pronounce the names, and had no idea what they were getting themselves into. But they recognized suffering when they saw it, And they did what humans do best. They helped, asked questions later, and figured out the impossible details along the way. That first act of kindness from complete strangers was something the Kithra had almost forgotten could exist in the universe. The practical stuff was a nightmare, honestly. The Kithra's bioelectric fields fried every piece of electronics within 50 feet, and their crystalline bodies needed specific minerals that Earth didn't exactly have lying around in convenient packages. But humans, they love a good challenge. Engineers like Blake Stevens and his team threw themselves into problem with that special brand of human stubbornness that has gotten us through everything from building the pyramids to landing on the moon. Picture this. You got beings whose very presence turns smartphones into expensive paperweights and makes hospital monitors explode in showers of sparks. The first week was chaos. Every time a Kithra got near modern medical equipment, the machines would start smoking, alarms would blare, and frustrated doctors would be left trying to check vital signs with stethoscopes and thermometers like it was 1,950 again. The Kithra felt terrible about it, constantly apologizing in their musical language that nobody understood yet, but which definitely sounded apologetic. Blake Stevens was a kind of engineer who looked at impossible problems and got excited instead of discouraged. He'd been designing backup power systems for hospitals when the call came in, and within hours he was standing in a medical tent watching a Kithra child accidentally turn a heart monitor into a pile of melted plastic. Instead of throwing up his hands in frustration, Blake started taking notes. These bioelectric fields weren't random. They had patterns, frequencies, predictable behaviors. If you could predict them, you could work around them. The first breakthrough came when Blake's team realized they were thinking about the problem backwards. Instead of trying to shield electronics from bioelectric interference, they started designing electronics that could actually use that energy. It took 3 weeks of trial and error, a lot of fried circuits, and more coffee than any human should reasonably consume, but they cracked it. The new medical monitors didn't just work around Kithra energy fields. They actually worked better because of them, but that was just the beginning. The mineral problem was even more complex. Kithra bodies needed specific crystalline compounds to maintain their structure and health, stuff that existed on Earth, but not in any form they could actually use. Dr. Jenny Walsh from the geology department at Montana State became an overnight expert in alien nutrition, spending 18-hour days figuring out how to process common Earth minerals into something Kithra physiology could absorb. The real magic happened when small communities started getting involved. The town of Glacier Falls, Montana, had a population of about 3,000 people who had never seen anything more exotic than the occasional tourist. When Blake's team asked if they could use the old mining equipment to process specialized minerals, the response wasn't just yes, it was, "What else do you need?" Within days, retired miners were working alongside quantum physicists, teaching them tricks about mineral extraction that you can't learn in any textbook. The building challenges were equally wild. Traditional construction materials either interfered with Kithra energy fields or couldn't handle the resonant frequencies their bodies naturally produced. Everything from concrete to steel had problems. So human engineers did what they do best. They improvised. They created hybrid building materials using a combination of earth metals and crystalline fragments the Kithra could spare, developing construction techniques that had never been tried before. The most amazing part was watching entire communities transform themselves to accommodate their new neighbors. Iceland's geothermal energy infrastructure turned out to be perfect for Kithra needs, and the small fishing village of Hoffen became an unlikely center for alien-human cooperation. Local families didn't just offer spare rooms. They learned to modify their homes, installing specialized lighting systems that complemented Kithra biology and creating spaces where both species could coexist comfortably. Children adapted fastest, as they always do. Human kids started learning basic Kithra communication through play, while young Kithra began picking up English with the speed that only comes from really wanting to connect with someone. The playground at Glacier Falls Elementary became a testing ground for cross-species friendship, with human children teaching Kithra youngsters how to ride bicycles, while learning in return how to make flowers bloom with just a touch. The hybrid medical centers Blake's team eventually created were unlike anything that had ever existed. Human doctors worked alongside Kithra healers, combining technological precision with bioelectric intuition. A human surgeon could perform delicate operations, while a Kithra healer accelerated tissue regeneration in real time. Broken bones that would normally take months to heal were fixed in days. Chronic illnesses that human medicine could only manage were completely cured. But perhaps the most impressive achievement was how normal it all became. Within 6 months, seeing a 7-foot crystalline being grocery shopping alongside human families wasn't unusual. It was just Tuesday in these small communities. The Kithra weren't exotic visitors anymore. They were neighbors, friends, and partners in building something entirely new. Humans had looked at impossible technical challenges and solved them through sheer determination, creativity, and the absolute refusal to accept that something couldn't be done. Everything changed when the hegemony came calling. Their scout fleet dropped out of hyperspace with enough firepower to turn continents into glass, demanding Earth hand over the war criminals. The alien commander probably expected humanity to fold immediately. After all, what could this primitive backwater do against superior technology? What they didn't expect was every major nation on Earth telling them exactly where they could stick their demands. More importantly, they didn't expect millions of ordinary humans to form human shields around Kithra settlements. Teachers, farmers, shop owners, kids, all standing between alien soldiers and their adopted neighbors, refusing to budge even with plasma rifles pointed at their faces. The hegemony ships were massive, sleek things that made humanity's best spacecraft look like paper airplanes. When they appeared in Earth's orbit, every military radar on the planet started screaming warnings. These weren't exploration vessels or diplomatic ships. These were warships, designed for one purpose: destroying things efficiently and completely. The lead vessel alone was 3 miles long, bristling with weapons that could probably vaporize entire cities from orbit. Commander Vex of the Gemini fleet was used to easy surrenders. In his experience, primitive civilizations took one look at superior firepower and immediately started negotiating about who to hand over and how quickly they could do it. He'd done this dance 100 times across the galaxy. Show up, make demands, collect the prizes, move on. Earth should have been the easiest job yet. These humans hadn't even achieved faster-than-light travel. For crying out loud. The response he got probably gave him whiplash. Instead of terrified planetary leaders begging for mercy, he received a coordinated message from every major government on Earth. The President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Britain, the leaders of China, Russia, India, Brazil, all delivering essentially the same message. Thanks for stopping by, but we're keeping our friends. Have a nice trip home. But the real shock came when Vex forces tried to land and collect the Kithra anyway. The first transport ships headed for Glacier Falls, Montana, expecting to find a defenseless alien settlement that could be quickly raided. Instead, they found something that probably broke their understanding of how civilizations work. Picture this scene. Thousands of ordinary humans had literally surrounded the Kithra residential areas, linking arms and refusing to move. These weren't soldiers or trained protesters. They were regular people who had decided enough was enough. Tom Rodriguez, who ran the local hardware store, stood next to Beth Chun, a kindergarten teacher, who was next to old Joe Murphy, a retired coal miner. Behind them were teenagers, college students, and even elementary school kids who had somehow convinced their parents to let them stand with their Kithra friends. When the first hegemony soldiers emerged from their landing craft, they found themselves facing something their training had never prepared them for. How do you deal with civilians who simply refuse to move? These humans weren't armed, weren't threatening, weren't even particularly hostile. They were just standing there, protecting their neighbors with nothing but their bodies and their stubborn refusal to step aside. The standoff lasted for hours. Hegemony soldiers, used to dealing with military resistance or immediate surrender, found themselves completely stumped by the concept of passive defiance. They had weapons that could level buildings, but what were they supposed to do with a 70-year-old grandmother who kept offering them homemade cookies while firmly explaining that she wasn't moving until they left her Kithra neighbors alone? Similar scenes played out across the globe. In Iceland, entire fishing communities surrounded the Kithra settlements with their boats, creating an impromptu naval blockade of civilian vessels. In Australia, Aboriginal communities who understood something about being displaced and persecuted stood shoulder to shoulder with crystalline beings who had become part of their extended families. The most powerful moment came when 6-year-old Annie Foster, whose best friend was a young Kithra named Resonance, walked up to a heavily armed alien soldier and asked him why he was trying to take her friend away. The soldier, probably weighing 3 times what the little girl did and carrying enough firepower to level a building, found himself trying to explain military orders to a child who just wanted to know why grown-ups were being mean to her friend. Social media exploded with images and videos of these confrontations. Hashtag #StandWithKithra started trending worldwide as millions of people shared stories of how their Kithra neighbors had helped them, healed their families, or simply become part of their communities. The message was clear. These weren't alien refugees anymore. They were friends, neighbors, and family. Commander Vex found himself in an impossible situation. His orders were clear: retrieve the Kithra criminals. But how do you fight an entire planet of civilians who refuse to cooperate? His weapons could destroy cities, but they couldn't make humans stop caring about their friends. For the first time in his military career, superior firepower was completely useless against an enemy that refused to fight back. The hegemony had conquered dozens of worlds, but they'd never encountered anything like humanity's response to injustice. These humans weren't just protecting aliens. They were protecting their chosen family, and they were willing to face annihilation rather than betray that bond. In the final confrontation above Earth's atmosphere, Elder Zephyrs made a choice that would reshape both species' futures. As human ships burn around them in hopeless defiance against superior firepower, the Kithra linked their bioelectric fields directly into Earth's power grid and communication networks. The resulting surge didn't just enhance human technology. It created a symbiotic bond that allowed human pilots to interface directly with their ships, human doctors to sense injuries at the cellular level, and human engineers to manipulate matter at the quantum scale. The hegemony fleet found itself facing not refugees and their primitive protectors, but a hybrid force that combined human adaptability and determination with Kithra bioelectric mastery. The space battle started exactly as Commander Vex expected it would, a one-sided slaughter. Human warships, even the most advanced ones, were like rowboats going up against aircraft carriers. The International Space Coalition had managed to cobble together every functional spacecraft on the planet, from military vessels to repurposed research stations, but they were laughably outgunned. Captain Riley Foster commanded the flagship, a converted Mars transport that had been hastily fitted with whatever weapons humanity could manage, and she knew they were all probably going to die in the next few minutes. But humans have this funny habit of fighting impossible battles anyway. The first wave of human ships charged straight into the hegemony formation, their pilots whooping and hollering like they were heading to a party instead of certain doom. They couldn't match alien firepower, but they could be unpredictable, chaotic, and absolutely refusing to give up. Human fighters weaved between massive hegemony cruisers like angry wasps, causing just enough damage and confusion to buy precious time for the evacuation efforts below. Elder Zephyrs watched from the surface as human ships exploded like dying stars against the cold backdrop of space. These brave, stubborn creatures were throwing their lives away for people they'd known for less than a year. The sight broke something inside him. Not his spirit, but his last reservation about fully trusting humanity with his people's greatest secret. The Kithra had never shared their deepest abilities with anyone, not even during the worst days of the hegemony wars. But watching humanity sacrifice, Elder Zephyrs made a decision that went against thousands of years of careful tradition. He called to every Kithra on Earth, their voices joining in harmonious resonance that began to build something unprecedented. What happened next changed physics, as both species understood it. The Kithra linked their bioelectric fields not just with each other, but with Earth's entire technological infrastructure. Power grids, communication satellites, internet networks, even the basic electrical systems in human brains. Everything became part of a single vast, living network. The transformation started as a gentle hum that people could feel in their teeth, then built to a crescendo that rewrote the rules of what was possible. Captain Foster felt it first. One moment she was struggling with manual controls while her ship fell apart around her. The next moment, the ship wasn't just responding to her commands. It was responding to her thoughts. She could sense every system, every weapon, every structural stress point as if they were parts of her own body. When she thought about dodging, the ship moved with impossible grace. When she focused on targeting, her weapons locked onto enemy vessels with supernatural precision. The same transformation was happening across Earth's entire defense network. Pilots found themselves flying with reflexes that shouldn't have been humanly possible. Engineers working on damaged systems could suddenly see molecular structures and manipulate matter at the atomic level with their bare hands. Doctors treating the wounded could sense injuries before they became visible, their touch somehow accelerating healing beyond anything medical science had achieved. But the most incredible change was in the human fighters themselves. They stopped thinking like individual pilots and started operating as a collective intelligence that somehow maintained their individual personalities and creativity. They could coordinate attacks with telepathic precision while still pulling off the kind of crazy, unpredictable maneuvers that had made them dangerous in the first place. Commander Vex watched his superior fleet suddenly start losing battles against inferior technology, and he couldn't understand what had gone wrong. Human ships that should have been debris were dancing through his formations like they were reading his tactical plans directly from his mind. His advanced targeting systems couldn't lock onto vessels that seemed to know where his weapons would fire before he gave the orders. The turning point came when Captain Foster's ship, now operating more like a living creature than a machine, did something that violated every law of physics Vex understood. It phased through a hegemony cruiser's shields, materialized inside the ship's hull, and disabled the vessel from within before phasing back out into space. The human pilot wasn't just using technology anymore. She was bending reality itself through some kind of hybrid consciousness that combined human intuition with alien bioelectric mastery. One by one, hegemony ships found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and completely outclassed by an enemy that had somehow evolved mid-battle. The refugees and their primitive protectors had become something entirely new, a hybrid force that represented the best of both species working in perfect harmony. Earth became more than a refuge that day. It became the birthplace of something the galaxy had never seen before, where two desperate species discovered that their greatest strength lay not in what made them different, but in their shared refusal to abandon those who needed sanctuary.